it's diversity, but also just the ins and outs of it in a less sort of punny manner. Probably shouldn't say ins and out. That's definitely not the right word.
No, ins and outs is probably a bad word for masturbation.
But
unless we're going to be talking really technically.
Very graphic details. But,
Alice Vickery.
well, hello there. My name is Alice Vickery, and you are listening to Cornish Kaleidoscope, the podcast where I talk to people from all over Cornwall who have used their diversity to fuel their success, using the many days and weeks and months of awareness out there as a guideline to find these very interesting individuals. And this month is May. It's Masturbation Month. Interesting title. I like the alliteration. I'm a big fan of that. And I'm talking to Hanna Toms here, who is the Education and Wellbeing Specialist for Brook in Cornwall. Hello, Hanna.
Hi there.
How you doing?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, good. You're here. It's happening. That's the main thing. But you don't just do the Brook stuff, do you? You do lots of other things when it comes to sex ed.
Yeah, so I also work for the Intercom Trust, who run a young LGBT youth group in Cornwall, and support their work around working with young people. And I've got my own business doing sort of SEN work, working with SEN young people, doing sex ed and professionals training as well. So a whole range of anything to do with sort of gender, sexuality, sex, and that's kind of my bag.
Big bag of sex ed. Toys, you can't say that. I'm going to have to be really careful with the puns here because I'm definitely going to accidentally say them. So when it comes to masturbation, because it's very much, I think people have a strong opinion on masturbation, whatever that might be. How does it tend to come across? What do they tend to come in and say?
My role is kind of mostly classroom based. So we go into schools and we talk to young people about sex, about relationships, and masturbation is one of the topics that comes up. And it's really interesting that you say that people have really strong opinions of it. And I think that the really strong opinion that most people have is that it shouldn't be talked about. So it's kind of quite groundbreaking that we're having this conversation
in the first place,
in public, in a public arena. I think that's fantastic. What we get from the young people that we talk to in class is an awful lot of giggling, and then a lot of young men predominantly kind of being quite comfortable to talk about that because that's something that they're familiar with talking about with their friends, and a lot of young women looking very, very embarrassed and like they just want to be anywhere else other than sort of in this session having this conversation with us.
Yeah. How do you address that? How do you...
And so I think that the really important thing is that we kind of allow the young men to realise that it is completely normal, and you know they can talk about it, they can laugh about it, and it's great for them that they can, but also to reassure young women that it is completely normal for women to masturbate as well, and that this kind of societal idea that it's only men that masturbate is just really not the case. I was just doing some research earlier, found a 2019 study in the UK that said that 91% of people say they masturbate. So that's really high statistics.
Very regular, yes.
Yeah, and most people said they started when they were 14, so that's our target audience, the young people we're talking with are kind of right in that age group.
Yeah.
And what we say to young women is that, you know, we know you don't feel the need to talk about it all the time like the boys do. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't feel able to do that, and that you should feel like you're doing something wrong or be ashamed of what you're doing. You know, until quite recently, there was an Ann Summers on the high street in Truro that sold sex toys. And if you can buy stuff on the high street, it means it's big business. It means that people are using it because otherwise it just, you know, the business sense, the business model for that being there wouldn't be around.
The big thing with all that as well is I know you say it's all right to not talk about it, but I find with a lot of young people, especially when I was younger anyway, it's a lot of understanding of what sex and masturbation and just a lot of taboo subjects that parents and teachers don't teach you. You find out from your friends, from sort of discussing, because my first understanding of masturbation was for a bloke. You think that it's potentially quite simple because there's one thing that does one thing and they know what feels good. And I know it's a lot more complicated than that, but that does that, right? But with a woman, I thought that you had like penetration was an essential part of masturbation, which actually isn't really. It can be the case, but obviously when you're starting as well, it that's quite a scary thing to start yourself out with before you.
Yeah.
So how do you How do you
how
have
we
that
get
conversation without it?
how we get around that really when we're talking to young people is about just explaining to them that they have a really good understanding of how what their body does and
Mm.
what feels good for them and what causes them pleasure. Um, in the context of a sex ed lesson, they're going to have a much better chance of kind of going on to have pleasurable sexual relationships because
Yes.
they'll be able to explain to their partner what they might like, and just learn themselves what they like. I think as a society and certainly as people who do sex ed, we get criticised a lot because we don't talk enough about female pleasure. But
Mm.
male pleasure in sex is assumed, in masturbation is assumed, but we don't talk enough about female pleasure. And so
Mm.
I think that as a team, we definitely have got a lot of conversations about this. How do we kind of work those in? How do we empower young people young women specifically, to be able to talk about pleasure and to be able to talk to their partners, whether they're male partners or female partners, about what they like? And masturbation is a sort of key part of that.
It's different having a conversation to actually sort of helping that happen, is it? So how do you encourage them then, apart from like actually saying, go and explore your body? Do you list off the medical benefits of masturbation, or how do
Yeah,
you?
I mean, we talk about it being a really great stress reliever,
Mm.
and that it's great for anxiety and that can help you sleep. So we do talk about all of those things. Sort of sexual frustration and how, as a teenager, so sometimes you don't recognise what that feels like, and sort of learning what your body feels like and how often you're comfortable with masturbating, how often you feel you need to masturbate.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about that. We're really positive about masturbation when we talk about it. We say that at Brook, we're big fans of this. This is something we kind of like definitely encourage. It's the safest form of sex there is. You can't get any STIs. There's no problems around consent with masturbation. So all of the kind of scary areas for young people around sex ed, there are sort of 3 or 4 things that young people find particularly scary about becoming sexual beings, and that's like pregnancy, STIs, consent are probably some of the things that are quite difficult for young people to navigate.
Yeah.
And of course, you don't have to worry about any of those things with masturbation. So it's a really great starting point.
It should be the first thing you do. It should be the first thing you do before you learn about anything else, really, is learning what it means to you, because then you understand how your body works, isn't it, going forward?
And wouldn't it be interesting that instead of kind of teaching sort of young people that the first thing that they learn about sex is how to make babies, which is probably like not like the most important thing about sex at all.
They were just babies. They were just babies 5 minutes ago. It's bonkers.
And they're definitely not thinking about having babies like at any time in the future. They're probably not even thinking about how to stop having babies. But that is the first thing that we teach young people about sex, is that this is the thing that happens, that babies are made.
Yeah.
And I think that, when we look at the statistics about how much sex is had to make babies and how much sex is had for pleasure, the kind of the education is somehow not quite doesn't quite line up with those statistics.
That's so interesting, isn't it? That we haven't cottoned on to that. Why do you think so? People are so against it. Do you think it's religious? Do you think it's just uncomfortable with the idea of
There's a certain amount of, it's like, no sex please, we're British, isn't it? We kind of live in a society where people don't talk about those things. And when you asked me to do this, I was kind of thinking about my friendship group and whether we talk about masturbation, and we definitely talk about sex and relationships, and we have like I have quite an open group of friends where we talk about an awful lot, but it's not one of the things that we talk about. So it's interesting that even people who are kind of really working in this field and talking about it all the time don't really talk about it in their social lives. It
themselves. That's really interesting, actually. And I often found that, if I ever sort of have a conversation with people about it, because I did when I was younger. I did when I was just a memory just popped up. I was quite an outspoken young person, because I was a young woman in sort of school, sort of 15, 16, and I spoke about sex. And I as someone who was a people pleaser and also an attention seeker, I found that reaction very, very satisfying. I enjoyed that. So I spoke about it quite a lot in not graphic detail, but just sort of just unashamed to talk about the things, and I would ask.
Loved that.
Yes, I did. I loved it in the same way that I think some young boys like to say the graphic details. I found even more response as a woman, so I really enjoyed it. And I remember once being in class, and we were talking about lubrication, sort of natural vaginal sort of lubrication, and I put my hand up and I was like, is that sort of like butter? Is that what it's like? And they said, no. And somebody then decided to call me for the rest of the year, I can't believe it's not butter, which was very, I thought it was very clever, to be fair, but they were the kinds of conversations that I would have, and everybody would go, oh no, Alice, no, don't talk about that.
We would love to have you in our classes, because we love it when young people kind of get properly stay up and have a bit properly involved. Yeah, definitely.
There's so much to learn about it, and we were so curious all the time. And in the same way that sex isn't supposed to be serious for the majority of the time, neither should the conversation about it be. And it's taught with such, look at these negatives, look at these bad things, look at these awful things that can happen if you don't take sex seriously. But that just creates an incredibly unhealthy relationship with sex itself. So why, with your physical wellness, why is pleasure so important?
The hormones that are released when we're happy, when we have pleasure, when we orgasm, just like really important for our well-being. We've been through a time where we haven't really been able to do much, and one of the things we can definitely do and have been able to do during lockdown is masturbate.
Yes.
And so there are ways of like having pleasure and that kind of that stress relief, that kind of learning about your body, that learning how to give yourself pleasure. Just so important, and so important for future sexual relationships, that you know how your body works, that you know how to get pleasure. Because I think, and certainly I know that I have friends that really spent their sort of younger life being really hung up on how sex works and didn't really get much pleasure out of it at all. And it's just like it's sad to see young people going through life not experiencing sex, having sex maybe for all the wrong reasons, and if the main reason to have sex is for pleasure, then that's kind of got to be the key to kind of the teaching about it.
Yeah. Do you think people have taken this time to explore their bodies, or do you think it's been more of a let's just kick off some stress and not really think about what we're doing?
I don't know. I read somewhere recently that sales of sex toys went through the roof during lockdown 1. And that there were an awful lot of sex toys being bought. So I guess that, that seems to suggest that a lot of people were kind of spending that time masturbating and having sex with their partners, and maybe with that time that we don't usually have.
What is your opinion on sex toys? Because I find this quite interesting, because I know there are male sex toys out there, but they're sort of predominantly or mainly advertised as a female thing. Do you think that it creates some sort of, in the negative way, do you think it creates some sort of barrier between someone connecting with their body? Because I have found the pros is obviously they're wonderful and very effective, and why not treat yourself to a whole new kind of sensation? There's nothing wrong with that, but also they can be somewhat addictive.
Yeah, I mean, masturbation can be somewhat addictive, and I think that there is an argument, isn't there? And they talk about how use of vibrators and stuff can make you less able to orgasm without one. So that is something to bear in mind. But I think, everybody kind of has to work this stuff out for themselves, and that the really important thing is to give people a sense of empowerment to go away and kind of have those experiments. Because what works for one person isn't going to work for another person. And the great thing about life and the great thing about sex is that we're all different. So I think that they've got a role, definitely. And some people like them and some people don't like them. And I think it's great that you can get those things, and for people who really struggle to orgasm at all, having that kind of something which is going to help that is really really empowering.
It's very useful. With it being Masturbation Month, there's lots of different elements here. So I suppose one of the things that has come up before when I've been looking into it is masturbation in regards to sexual trauma. And how that can be somewhat restorative after you have that experience with someone else.
It does make sense, doesn't it, that if you've kind of had a really traumatic relationship or a traumatic sexual experience, then, you know, the one person you can trust to stop when you say stop,
Yeah.
and is yourself. And so that building up that ability to be a sexual person again through masturbation just seems to make sense if someone can get through that.
Comfortable with
They
themselves
don't know,
again.
yeah, get comfortable with themselves again, exactly.
Well, I suppose this
Start getting rid of maybe some of the shame that's attached to sexual trauma.
it still sort of hangs around the area, but this is partially why I bring up the sex toy thing, is that once I had experienced sexual trauma and then started using a sex toy and pornography, right? So I was, easing the sexual frustration with whilst being as entirely detached from my body as I possibly could be. So you see, it's a juxtaposition there, isn't it? Because I'm doing the thing that should hopefully help, but without actually connecting at all.
Yeah, it's interesting the kind of use of pornography in that, because I think quite a lot of porn has quite violent scenes in it. The way women are treated in porn is not often very consensual. It doesn't kind of show women in a good light. So it's kind of like maybe does shut down that kind of intimacy and the warmth and the closeness that can kind of come with masturbation with yourself, or with sex with a partner. It's almost with, like what you're saying, with porn, it's sort of taking yourself out of the equation, really, and kind of off into fantasy land rather than it being something which is personal.
Yeah. What do you think of porn?
And there's definitely pros in porn. That it can be really pleasurable to watch porn, and let's face it, that's why it's been made, because people get pleasure from using it. I think it can show different types of different sexual activities that maybe aren't so easily talked about. I think we do a session on porn, and we talk a lot about and as we also say to young people, if you were going to wanted to research some history, what you'd do is you'd go online and you'd research history. And so if you want to find out about sex, you're going to go online and find out about sex.
Yes.
And so you're going to get porn.
Yes.
And that's a completely valid thing to do. But there are just some kind of caveats around, porn isn't sex.
As you say, it's often having the conversation. If you talk about it and you realise
it's about conversation.
Yeah, what works and what doesn't, then you know, and then you're clued up when you're watching it, I suppose, as well. Masturbation for someone who doesn't identify as binary, either gender, sort of, trying to understand their genitalia that does abide to one gender. How must they feel?
I mean, yeah, it can be really confusing for non-binary people, and for I work quite closely with a lot of trans young people, and they say that they find that their gender dysphoria is really their body dysphoria is really heightened by the need to masturbate, and they often find it, so young trans women, so people who were assigned male at birth but identify as female, find that waking up in the morning with an erection really, really traumatic, and having that physical need for release being really difficult to cope with, really traumatic time, and really makes their gender dysphoria a lot worse. And non-binary people, I guess there are so many different ways to be non-binary. Some people will be absolutely fine with their genitalia. Some people will struggle in much the same way as trans people do. It's a very difficult area, and lots of support and lots of kind of ability to create the space so that the young people can have those conversations and say that this makes them feel uncomfortable. You can be sometimes the only person that they could have that conversation with, and just being able to say to an adult, this makes me feel really uncomfortable, and just having a conversation about what the workarounds might be, and have their experience acknowledged.
Validated yourself. Talking about sort of relationships and masturbation in relationships, because some people I've heard, I haven't experienced this, but I've heard they sort of classify that as cheating.
you get different things out of them. You know, you might be really stressed or anxious and want to masturbate when your partner isn't feeling like having sex at all, and so that's completely fine. It's like, you know, it almost takes pressure off the relationship. It takes pressure off your partner to kind of be the person that causes the orgasm, because, you know, if you can do it yourself, then you know, it's really more
exactly
equal.
you take responsibility for yourself, and it's lovely if the other person can help out, but also it's not the be all and end all. I think it's peculiar, but it's true that touching yourself in front of your partner is almost the most vulnerable and the most sort of open,
one of the most intimate things you can do.
You can possibly be. Honestly, I don't think I can think of anything more that would top that, because the level of comfort you have to feel to be able to do that with a partner,
and the level of confidence in the relationship and confidence with yourself as well, to be observed like that.
Yeah, for someone to so closely watch you.
When you've got two people who are having sex with each other, they're both engrossed in this private act, but if you've got someone who's kind of sitting back watching, it almost becomes, I mean, not public, because that would be really wrong, but kind of you know, having someone watching you is it can be quite intimidating. Having someone watch you do anything can be quite intimidating. So to do something so personal,
it's like someone having someone watch you get dressed afterwards. Because that's when the sexual activity is no longer there anymore. That's not part of it anymore, and so they're sort of seeing you without all the lust, without the sort of cloud of
all of the wobbly bits, without without
putting on the dressing gown, so 1 foot cocked up in the air trying to put on some trousers. It's just not sexy anymore, is it?
It's not sexy anymore.
But that's the, I suppose that's the special bit, isn't it, when you let someone in. Masturbation and disability.
Yeah, so a really important point is to kind of remember that people with disability can sometimes be seen to be non-sexual beings, and it's really important as professionals who work with people, with any people, and whether you're in a caring capacity or in a health capacity, it's really important that we remember that people with disability also are sexual beings, and they might need assistance with masturbation, whether it's kind of their carer buying them a vibrator or something like that. But it can be a really difficult conversation for them to have with carers. So it's just well worth bringing up and kind of just bearing that in mind, because it's something that does seem to kind of get missed a lot when you're having conversations about, you know, how do people with a disability masturbate, and how do people with a disability access the things that they need to masturbate.
Yeah, and that's sort of awkward conversation on top of awkward conversation, isn't it? I also looked at sort of plus-sized pleasure and masturbation, because they, you know, from the way they're portrayed in social media, as we say, it's very much like a super sexualized thing, like a fetishized thing almost, or complete opposite.
Yeah, so there's no middle ground, is there? There's no sort of sense in the media that people can be large, be plus side, and they're either really, really sexual, or they're completely, they have no sex lives at all, and they're not seen as sexual beings at all. And, you know, they're just the same as anyone else. Some of us will be really sexually driven, and some of us won't be. And that is just that's the great thing about all this, is just that everyone's different. Everyone's sex drive is different and exciting. And to be able to kind of come on to something like this and talk about it really openly is
have a conversation about
really
it.
Fun.
Yes, it is. It is fun.
Back to what you were just saying about plus size people. One thing we haven't really touched on is older people. We've talked a lot about young people because that's the focus of my job. But also, like, older people carry on having sex lives and carry on masturbating, you know, all of their lives.
Of course. But it's the idea again. The idea of masturbation is uncomfortable anyway for the majority of people, and then on top of that you put, as I said earlier, you put another awkward idea on. So someone who isn't perfect skinned or perfectly aged or perfectly bodied, like, it just makes it that even further away. But of course they must. Of course, it's probably what you do with a lot of your time once you're retired. I have to assume that's what I do. So
this is what you do with your retirement in Cornwall.
It's why they all come down here, isn't it? They like the fresh sea breeze and a few other things. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed this.